Welcome to our Tiyul on Shimshon and the Philistine. Shulie, I'm so glad to be back with you here again.
Always a fun day.
Yeah. So we're going to be talking today about Shimshon and the Philistine. And I just want to situate Shimshon a little bit within the context of Sefer Shoftim and the Tanakh. Of course, Shimshon is our last Shofet, and he appears at the end of a period that really deteriorates. It deteriorates religiously and socially. And the way in which this finds expression and what we're going to be talking about today is that also in terms of the military situation, things have deteriorated, and that of course is a consequence of their sinfulness. So God has sent them this very problematic enemy, and of course the Philistine are the first existential threat to Am Yisrael since they entered the land and since they conquered the land. And when they appear here at the end of the period of the Shoftim, it really represents a very significant military threat.
It's also very interesting because the area where our stories are taking place, where we're going to be spending our day, is in this area, Ben Sorah ve'Eshtaol, as we're going to talk about Shimshon, and it's in a very interesting area in terms of both internal conflicts of Am Yisrael and external conflicts. So externally, we have, like you said, this existential threat of the Philistine. Philistine come into the land from the west, right? Bnei Israel come into the land from the east. Who's stuck in the middle in this buffer zone and gets the worst of both worlds? The Knaanim. And we're really in this area of the Shvela, of the valleys here, and we'll see it in Tel Beit Shemesh, this fascinating dispute over who gets what, and places changing hands, right? Israel conquers, the Philistine conquer, the Knaanim stay in place. Who does it belong to? Where's the ethnicity? That's a fascinating question, right? And of course it's precipitated by these invasions of the Philistine and of Am Yisrael. But we're also going to see internal conflicts in Am Yisrael. We're in Shevet Dan, but maybe we're in Shevet Yehuda. We're going to talk about that. And they don't always get along so well either. And Dan is squeezed by the Philistine, but he's also squeezed by his brothers, Shevet Yehuda. So we're going to have all of these various conflicts playing themselves out against the backdrop of the Shimshon story.
Okay, so when we talk about the placement of Shevet Dan in the land of Israel, it's important to keep in mind that, at least according to Chazal, Dan originally has two portions, right? When they talk about Yizanek min ha-Bashan, right? He pounces from the Bashan. So the Bashan is all the way north. So it seems that there is this kind of original conception of Dan as being placed also all the way in the north, next to Asher and Naphtali, right up there with the maidservants. And he gets another portion down here where we are in Tel Tzorah. So, when we talk about this idea of Yehuda and Dan being next to each other, and maybe we'll use it in order to try to understand why Dan gets these two separate areas in the land of Israel, right? So I mean, we'll start just by saying that there's something very similar about the description of Yehuda and the description of Dan. And it's going to be very important, I think, for understanding Shimshon. And that is that they're both described as a Gur Aryeh, right? In the Brachot of Yaakov, Yehuda is this Gur Aryeh, this lion cub. And in the Brachot of Moshe, at the end of Devarim, it's Dan who is described as this lion cub, as this Gur Aryeh.
Which also the only two lion fights in Tanakh.
Well, exactly why that's relevant to Shimshon. Two people in Tanakh who fight a lion with their bare hands, Shimshon from the tribe of Dan and David from the tribe of Yehuda, and that of course relates to the fact that they come from these leonine kind of tribes. But what I think is important for our purposes is that of course they both have leadership roles, right? A lion of course is the leader. Chazal say he has the strength of a lion and the chutzpah of a cub, right? The chutzpah of the cub. So he has this kind of ferocity about him, which is going to enable him to have a protective role. We see it especially in the Midbar. When they're walking in the Midbar, so who is situated at the front?
Is Yehuda.
Yehuda Barishona. Who is situated at the back? Dan is the Me'asef. They're placed in these kind of two very vulnerable spots, right? We have the vanguard and the rear guard, right? We have the one who's going in the front, who's leading the people. Arguably, the back area is the actually most vulnerable area. That's where the weak and the nechashalim, right? The chalashim are in the back. And Dan is protecting them from those Amalekim and any other sneaky enemies who try to pick off the weak ones from the back. Now, what happens in the land of Israel is that the placement of Dan and Yehuda kind of imitates the placement in the Midbar when they were walking. We have Yehuda on our southern border, and we have Dan on our northern border, which is arguably the more precarious, the more vulnerable place. Mitzafon tipatach hara'ah, right? So we have, again, Yehuda on one side protecting us from our southern enemies, Dan on our northern border protecting us from our northern enemies. So then you might ask, so why is Dan here in the southwestern area at all? And I think that relates to what we were saying before, which is that the Philistine are our first existential threat once we conquer the land of Israel. And so what we have in this placement of Yehuda next to Dan on the southwestern border is that they become this kind of buffer zone between the Philistine and the land of Israel, or the Philistine and Eretz Binyamin, which is of course the place of the Mishkan, and they're placed together to become this almost, unstoppable force, these two lion cubs that are situated to fight the Philistine, who are, of course, have the ferocity of lion cubs.
Unfortunately, they don't join together, like we see in the story of Shimshon.
Yes.
They're meant to do one thing, but they end up subverting that completely and fighting against each other.
Yes, and of course, the end of the story of Shoftim is that the Philistine remain very successful, and they penetrate through. And when we find them next in Shmuel Aleph, Parak Daled, they're going to be already in hill country, right? In Afek, and then later on in Giv'ah, right? In Giv'at HaElokim, which is in Binyamin.
To Emek Israel.
So the lack of the lack of joining forces has some very serious repercussions.
So yeah, we came up here to tell Sorah in the middle of this beautiful forest, Yar HaNasi, and we have this amazing view where we can look all the way out to Harei Yehuda, but we also have below us today, modern, the city of Beit Shemesh, IKEA, we could do a little stop, right below us, right, what we call the Shvela, and we are really in this area of Shimshon, Sorah, and Eshtaol. And when we think about it, we say, of course, Shimshon is from Shevet Dan, and we know this area belongs to Shevet Dan, nachon, right? We open up Sefer Yoshua, Perek Yutet, V'hi gvul nachlatam, Tzorah, ve'eshtaol, ve'ir Shamesh, right? Ir Shamesh may be another name for Beit Shemesh, right? So here it is, it belongs to Mateh B'nai Dan. Very nice, except if we flip a few pages back, we see the very much longer and more extensive Nachala of Mateh B'nai Yehuda, right? And Yehuda, we know, they have the mountains, they also have the desert further to the east, but they also have the Shvela. And look at what we have over here in Perek Tevav. Bashvela Eshtaol Vitzorah. So who does this belong to, right? Is this Yehuda? Is this Dan? This is part of the problem that we have in our story. We're going to see that in the story of Shimshon later on, not only are the Plishtim angry at Shimshon, but the people of Yehuda are angry at Shimshon. They are not pleased in the least that Shimshon is making all this trouble with the Plishtim. And in Perek Tetvav, Vayalu Plishtim vayachanu b'Yehuda vayinatshu b'lechi vayomru ish Yehuda lama alitem. Shimshon, we've come to get Shimshon. He's a problem for us. So the people of Yehuda say, maybe we'll help them. Vayirdu 3,000 ish miYehuda. Vayomru Shimshon, halo yadata ki moshlim banu plishtim u'ma zot asita lanu. What are you making trouble? These are the guys in charge. Stop messing around. And they want to arrest Shimshon themselves. So we're seeing that there's not only an external conflict playing out here, it's an internal conflict as well. The conflict becomes so bad, and maybe you want to talk a little about the chronology. It's a little confusing when this story happens, but it becomes so bad that Shevet Dan at a certain point says, enough. I don't want to be here anymore. Stuck between the Philistine on one side of me, Yehuda on the other side of me, and they go as far away as they can. They go all the way to the north, which is why, by the way, we have Tel Dan in the north, but we have Gush Dan over here. Dan is in both places. So we are still here in Tel Sorah, and we are by, and I'd like you to notice that the writing here, it says Kever Shimshon and this nice engraved sign, but somebody added above it Tziyun, okay? Meaning it's not the real Kever Shimshon, which even the people who come here to pray seem to have come to that realization. How do we know that this is not really Kever Shimshon Mashiach B'doro that you're going to talk about, Manoach Aviv? Very simple. We're in the middle of the town of Tzorah. There have been, not so much, but there have been some archaeological excavations that have happened here. Jews do not bury in the middle of a town. We're not even on the outskirts of the town. We're in the town. So the likelihood that there's a kever here really makes very, very little sense. This does not stop the many Hasidim of Shimshon to come up here, to pray here, to have parties up here. We see the remains, and this is a very popular site. We're going to see something else that is perhaps the real Kever Shimshon.
Okay, well, wherever the real Kever Shimshon is, we know that Manoach is buried there as well, because that's a pasuk in the Tanakh. And so I want to talk a little bit about Manoach, or more significantly, Manoach's wife, whose name is Eshet Manoach. Okay, so it's one of the curiosities in the story is why she doesn't get a name. But even before that, really, why this is such a long, protracted story about Shimshon's parents. And it's an entire parak about the story of Shimshon's birth. What is the idea of the story? And perhaps more significantly, why doesn't she have a name? So the problem with the fact that she doesn't have a name is compounded by the fact that she's really the main figure in the story, right? Of course, the angel appears to her, and she's the one who receives the divine oracle. And she goes to her husband and tells her husband, what the angel told her. And then he says, well, maybe that malach should come again to us, right? And tell us what should be that child's path, what his destiny should be. And she says, okay, and Manoach davens. And so the angel comes again to her, right?
I always feel like Manoach is the comic relief in the story.
Well, certainly Manoach is portrayed as a less intuitive, or maybe even a less, spiritually intuitive figure. Chazal say, Manoach am haaretz haya, right? It's a Gemara in Eruvin. Yeah. He was ignorant. I don't know if I would go that far, but certainly what we sense, or the portrait of Manoach's wife, is that she's deeply, profoundly aware of the presence of God. So even more so, I think we have to ask ourselves the question, why is she unnamed and he's named? Very humorously, Rav Breuer used to refer to Manoach as Ba'ala shel Eshet Manoach, right? The husband of the wife of Manoach, in order to emphasize that really he is the one who should be unnamed here, and it makes no sense that she doesn't have a name. So I want to just examine this kind of briefly. I mean, the topic of people, anonymous characters, important characters who don't get a name is a very important topic in Tanakh, and in Sefer Shoftim in particular, right? We have the daughter of Yiftach. She's a very central figure in the story. She doesn't get a name. We have the concubine in Giv'ah. She doesn't get a name. So we have several important unnamed figures.
Generally women, no? Do we have men who are anonymous?
Well, we have in Megillat Ruth, we have Ploni Almoni, right? He is called no name, right? We have all sorts of figures throughout Tanakh that are unnamed, both men and women, and for different reasons. Sometimes people don't get a name because they're not really so central to the story. They're just agents in the story. Sometimes people don't get a name in order to emphasize perhaps that they are being objectified in the story, like I think is the case both with Bathi Yiftach and the Pilegesh Begiv'ah. And sometimes people don't get a name, and I think that this is the case with Ploni Almoni, because they haven't fulfilled their destiny, right? Ploni Almoni's role, of course, was Lahakim Shem Hamet al Nachalato.
And he doesn't do it, so right. He doesn't get a shame.
Here I think is something similar, and to understand Eshet Manoach's failure, I think, is to understand Shimshon a little bit better, and of course also to understand why she doesn't get a name, and why the story of Shimshon's parents is so important in the backdrop of the Shimshon story. And it fits within the broader context of the barren women's story. But I want to start with an observation made by Abarbanel, which is that when Shimshon's mother, when Eshet Manoach comes to her husband to tell him about the words of the Malach, she actually kind of twists the words of the Malach. Abarbanel points out, she omits something and she adds something. When the Malach Hashem comes to Eshet Manoach, he tells her, Ki hinach hara v'yoladit ben, umora lo ya'ale al rosho, ki nazir Elohim yeh nar mina baten, v'hu yachel lo shia et Yisrael mi'ad Plishtim. You are going to be pregnant, you're going to have a son. This child is going to be a Nazir. You won't be able to cut his hair. And he will begin to save Am Yisrael from the Plishtim. Now, when Eshet Manoach comes to her husband, she omits one very important thing. She omits his divine destiny. She doesn't say it. And she adds one thing. And the Abarbanel says this, I think, in his third question on this parak. She adds, Ki nazir Elohim yeh hanar min habeten ad yom moto.
Which the Malach did not say.
He is going to be a Nazir until the day of his death, which is a very perplexing thing to say before he's even been born. She comes and she's already anticipating his death, and she omits his divine destiny, which, by the way, I think is one of the reasons that Manoach is so insistent upon the Malach coming again.
Because why would he bother to come if there wasn't some special?
Yeah, and also, what should we do with this divine child, this miraculous child? V'yoreinu ma na'aseh nar hayulad. He needs to come back and tell us what to do. Well, she knows exactly what he's supposed to do. He's supposed to go and save Am Yisrael from the Plishtim, but she never tells that to Manoach. Why doesn't she tell that to Manoach? And why is she already anticipating his death at his birth oracle? So I think that this really fits within the broader framework of the stories of barren women in Tanakh. Because what's interesting about the story is that they kind of unfold in similar ways. A lot of people note that. But what sometimes I think we miss is that miracle child who is born later on in the story has to be relinquished by the parents to their divine destiny, right? So we have the story, of course, of Akedah Yitzchak, the miracle child of Avram and Sarah. We have the story of Yaakov and Esav, where Rivka recognizes, she says, Lama eshkol gam shnechem yom echad, right? She relinquishes Yaakov, and she doesn't see him again, right? We have the story, of course, of Yosef, the miracle child, who Yaakov has to relinquish. I think something similar is going on here, where Eshet Manoach is very wary of having this miracle child who she then has to relinquish to his divine destiny. And she does not mention his divine destiny, and she already says, ad yom moto. And the way that I think that this really comes to a head is at the beginning of the Shimshon story, where Shimshon quite famously opens his story, right, by seeing this Plishti woman in Timnah, and he likes her. He yashra be'enav, right? Yeah. And so he comes to his parents and he says, "Ra'iti v'timnata mi benot Plishtim v'ata k'cho tali le'isha." He's talking to his father and his mother. His father doesn't know that his divine destiny is to fight the Plishtim. Right. Who does know that? His mother. And this seems to be the moment that we've been waiting for, right? She's meant to take Shimshon aside and say, well, my son, this is the moment that I tell you that a Malach Hashem came to me and told me that your destiny is to save Am Yisrael from the Plishtim, not to marry the Plishtim. The next pasuk is very interesting because the next pasuk tells us, Vayomer lo aviv v'imo. The word Vayomer is singular. Right. It modifies Manoach. Manoach said to him, and his mother, right? So that she's standing there as a silent partner. And Manoach, of course, tries to convince Shimshon not to marry her, right? Manoach says, Ha'ein bivnot achecha, uvechol ami isha, ki ata olech lakachat isha mi plishtim ha'arelim. Right?
You'll find a nice Jewish girl.
Exactly. But, Manoach's words are not particularly persuasive because Shimshon is quite enamored of this Plishti woman. Had his mother at this point given him perhaps the information of his divine destiny, perhaps things would have unfolded differently. And the fact that she stays silent, I think that's why she loses her name.
Wow, that's a very powerful idea. But I think also you could say she talks about the day of his death and she leaves out his divine destiny. She's like every mother, meaning I don't want to think about that because one thing is going to lead to the other. She's a real mother.
Yeah. No, I mean, the fact that she doesn't fulfill her divine destiny is, it may be some measure of a critique, but certainly I think we understand her.
So here we are in Tel Beit Shemesh, modern Beit Shemesh with all the stores and the high-rises and the coffees across the street. But we're in the original Beit Shemesh. Now this is not a place that's particularly connected to Shimshon, but everything around it is connected to the story of Shimshon. So we can see off in the distance, we can see Tel Tzorah, where we were earlier today. Okay, below us is the deep riverbed, the wadi of Nachal Sorek, which Shimshon, of course, that's where he meets his end with Delilah, not his end, but his downfall, right? Timnah is a tel down below Tel Tzorah, Tel Betesh. So we're really in an area that is part of our story, and we're looking out towards Plishti land, right? Now, this is an interesting place to talk about an element of the Shimshon story that we don't think about so much, right? Shimshon is always traveling back and forth from the tribe of Dan's land to Plishti land. And nobody seems to stop him. He doesn't need a visa, he doesn't need a passport, nobody asks him any questions. It seems to be very fluid, this back and forth. Right? And if we contrast that, we go a little further in time and we come to the beginning of Sefer Shmuel. Right? We have the story, which is the story I usually tell here, which is the story of the Aron. Right? The Aron that's stolen goes to Plishti land, travels around from place to place until finally the people of Ekron say, enough, we're sending it back to Yehudah. And they send it to Beit Shemesh, right? And they go. But if you remember in that story, the elders, the Sarnei Plishtim, they don't cross over. They follow behind as the wagon with the cows pulls the Aron. But as soon as they see it kind of heading into the Eretz Yehudah and the area of Beit Shemesh, they've gotten the proof that they need it and they go home. But you get the feeling that they also are uneasy. They don't want to cross over this border, whatever it might be. So sometime between the story, the time period of the Shoftim and Shimshon, and the time period of Shmuel, something happens, something changes here. There's something that's more kind of set in place. And that's just an interesting thing to discover. And all of these areas around here, all of the tells in the valley, in the Shvela, in Emek HaElah in particular, which is where we are, one of the biggest questions we ask here is ethnicity. Who does this belong to? Is this Canaanite? Is this Philistine? Is this Israelite? It's not always so easy to tell, right? They're all living within a few miles of each other. They're buying their dishes from the same place, right? How do we determine ethnicity? Which is a very interesting question, which has a lot of different answers. But what we see in Tel Beit Shemesh, right? Tel Beit Shemesh is a very old Canaanite city. It goes back at least to the 14th century before the Common Era. Right? It's an important Canaanite city. It may have even had a queen and not a king. We have some evidence of that. But what we see in Tel Beit Shemesh is layers upon layers of destruction, rebuilding, destruction, rebuilding. It keeps being conquered, taken away from the Canaanim, given to the Plishtim, given back to the Canaanim. Ultimately, it becomes an Israelite city and a very powerful Israelite city. But this is an area where there's conflict all the time. And that's part of the story that we were telling earlier about Dan, who's squeezed both by the Plishtim and Yehudah, and the Canaanites are in that same kind of stuck in the middle position of being between Plishtim, Israel. Are they going to survive? Some people even suggest that the Canaanites stop eating pig because they want to dissociate themselves with the Plishtim. We don't want to have anything to do with those conquerors. So this is a very, very interesting area. We have gotten to the point of the day where we need to talk a little about the Plishtim. And what better place to talk about the Plishtim than in this massive city that belonged to them. It's called Tel Asafi, but we know now today, 98% sure that this is Gat. Right? Why do we think it's Gat? So for a long time there were questions about identification of two of the Plishti cities, Gat and Ekron. And Ekron has its own interesting story. This Tel, which has been dug now for at least 20 years, Professor Aaron Mayer, they found so many Plishti artifacts. Add to that the fact that it is a very powerful city. You have from the top this incredible 360-degree view of everything around. They can control everything. And we have other things that fit with Tanakh that tell us that this is Gat of the Plishtim, one of the most powerful Plishti cities, and really a symbol of the threat to Am Yisrael because it's also inland. It's not on the coast. And we're very close to Eretz Dan, Eretz Yehuda, and there's this huge gorilla in the room that's just frightening to the people to the east of us. If we're here already, let's talk for a few minutes about the religion of the Plishtim, because that also comes a little bit into the story with Shimshon. So we know that towards the end of Shimshon's life, once his strength is gone, he's blinded, and then the very last scene that we have with Shimshon when he's alive is at this feast. V'sarnei Plishtim ne'asfu izvoch zevach gadol ledagon Eloheim l'simcha v'yamru natan Eloheinu b'yadeinu et Shimshon oivenu. And they have this huge feast for their god Dagon, and they bring out Shimshon, and of course we know the end of the story, spoiler alert, right? Shimshon is going to wreck the palace of Dagon and kill the Plishtim along with himself. When the Tanakh talks about Plishtim and their religion, we get very little information. We know they worship this god Dagon. Is Dagon a fish god, right, with a fish, kind of a fish head and a different kind of a body? Plishtim live by the coast, or is it actually Dagon? Is it a grain god? Either one could work. We hear about Dagon, we hear about it in the same story that we mentioned before with the Aron. Right? We hear about Dagon. The other thing we hear about the Plishtim, and it's not necessarily a religious element, but it's something that Tanakh harps on over and over and over again, is that they are uncircumcised, right? They are Plishtim ha'arelim. That's what we hear about them. But we don't know anything else about their religion, which fits with Tanakh, because Tanakh doesn't care so much. But we are finding out more and more from archaeology, and this is why this is a great place to talk about this, because in the excavations that have been done in Gat, they uncovered an altar, a completely intact altar. Looks a lot like our kind of a Mizbech HaKtoret, a small altar, except instead of 4 horns, it has only 2 horns. Not because 2 were broken off, but because it was made with 2, and some people suggest that it's meant to look like a bull, right? We know that the Plishtim originally come from the Aegean Sea. They are connected to the Minoan culture. Bulls are very important. So that's one thing we start to learn about them. So have we put together what is the religion of the Plishtim? Not 100%, but we know a lot more, and we will learn more and more as we uncover more from archaeology.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Plishtim don't just have a powerful city. They are themselves considered to be powerful and ferocious fighters. So that, the way that they're described often in the Tanakh as, in terms of their weaponry, right? Think of the description of Goliath, or in terms of their great height, in terms of their great numbers. They're really a threat. They're a threat to Am Yisrael because they're extremely powerful and they rely on their power, right? Which again, and I assume that that's pretty typical for powerful nations. But what's important for our purposes, for the Shimshon story, is that we mentioned previously that Shimshon comes from Dan, which is a tribe that is called a Gur Aryeh. And the other most important, let's say, figure that comes from a Gur Aryeh tribe, of course, is David, right? And what's interesting about both of these figures, and I think we may have mentioned it earlier, is that both of them fight lions barehanded. And it's an interesting element in the story because it immediately draws our attention to a certain similarity that seems to exist between Shimshon and David. And it's not just that they both fight lions, it's that this fight with lions is meant to prepare them for fighting the Plishtim, who are lion-like, right? So that this is David's whole argument when he comes before Shaul. He says, well, Shaul says, you can't go fight that Plishti giant, that Goliath. You're just a boy, and he's a very experienced warrior. And David says to Shaul, he says, well, I fought lions when I was out, shepherding. And, the same thing, and, he says, since I've fought lions, I can also fight the Plishtim. And the same thing, I think, is part of the Shimshon story, where Shimshon, on his way to Timnah, right, this lion comes out roaring to greet him. And therefore, when he fights this lion, he's given the message, you can fight the Philistine. It's a kind of a subtle message, right?
It's also the first time we really see his strength, right? We don't see it before that.
Yeah, that's where we first see his strength, and it's but it's a preparatory story, so that these lion cubs fight lions so that they can go fight the lion-like Philistine. But what's interesting about Shimshon and David is that the similarity doesn't end there, right? The similarity continues with some other very striking things about these two figures. One is that if you notice, Shimshon walks around town unencumbered by weapons, right? He does not use conventional weapons. Now, of course, as you mentioned before, in Tel Beit Shemesh, right, he's walking in some dangerous territory, right? He's going between, the Plishti cities, and yet he walks around without a conventional sword or spear.
He doesn't have a pistol in his backpack.
He doesn't. But therefore, he uses this kind of, whatever spontaneously he can find, whether it's fox's tails or the jawbone of a donkey or his own hands. And it reminds us also of David, right, who goes into warfare and he says, and he picks up, you come to me with the sword and the spear and the javelin. I come to you with the name of God. And of course, he picks up those smooth stones from the wadi. So there's something about both of these men, which is part of, I think it's part of the fact that they come from these lion-like tribes that equips them to fight the Philistine. There is one other point that I think is similar between Shimshon and David, and maybe that's something that everyone's thinking of at this point, which is that they have similar strengths, but these strengths also lead to a similar weakness, right? And that is, of course, the weakness for women. What this tells us about their strength is that it has potential for good and it has potential for bad, which is true, of course, about any trait, right? There's a wonderful midrash in Kohelet Rabbah, which makes this point and says, Yesh shehirbu chochmatan letova, v'yesh shehirbu l'ra'ah. Some people use their wisdom for good and some use it for bad, and they bring several examples. V'yesh shehirbu gvuratan letova, v'yesh shehirbu l'ra'ah. Some people use their strength for good and some people use it for bad, and they bring as examples David and Shimshon. There is a sense here that this kind of passion that they have can be used for good and it can be used for bad. The other point, though, that I want to make is that Shimshon is obviously, we talked about this before, he's placed at the end of Sefer Shoftim, and he's given the job of being the final chance at kind of, pulling the people out of the mire of Sefer Shoftim, right? He has the spiritual leadership of the tribe of Dan, which we talked about before. He has the military leadership. He can unify the people if he wants. He has the passion, right? There are so many things that need to be done. He can lay the groundwork for building the Beit HaMikdash. He does not succeed in pulling Am Yisrael. In all of these things that he doesn't succeed, David does, right? David does unify the people. David is, of course, the one who succeeds ultimately in his military battle against the Plishtim in Shmuel Bet Perek Hey. And of course, David is the one who lays the groundwork for the building of the Beit HaMikdash. The real question is, why does David succeed where Shimshon does not?
And we'll see why David is able to succeed. I would say also not necessarily strength only, but also appetite. Right? These are people who have great appetite. You mentioned the women, right? Yeah. They have great appetites, which, as we know, can be used for good or for bad. So Yael, we finally made it here at the end of our very long day to Kever Dan. What Dan? Where does that have to do with anything in our story? So the truth is, we are very close to Tel Tzorah. We're not too far from Tel Eshtaol. This is a much more logical place for Ben Tzorah uben Eshtaol if we want to talk about Kever Shimshon. The tradition, which is not a very old tradition, it's in the last few decades, is that this is Kever Dan ben Yaakov. We have a much older tradition, ironically passed down to us by the Arabs, that this is the grave of a very strong man, right? Strong man, Shimshon. Is this Shimshon's real grave? Maybe, maybe not. I'm not going to guarantee anything.
Okay, so here we're talking about the last moments of Shimshon's life, which I think are a little bit controversial. Because I think some people look at it and say, wow, in this final moment of his life, he brought the house down and he really, wreaked havoc upon the enemy. And some of our Parshanim are really very concerned about this story. So, for example, Rashbam, in his Perush in Bereshit, says, for those people who think that Dan Yadin Amo is written about Shimshon, they're incorrect, because he says, V'chi Yaakov ba lihitnabot al Adam, shenafal biyad Plishtim, v'yenakru et einav, umet im Plishtim b'inyan ra, chalila chalila. He said, would the pasuk be talking about a figure like Shimshon, who fell into the hands of the Plishtim, and they put out his eyes, and then he died in these very negative circumstances? So the Rashbam is not very favorably inclined towards Shimshon in his death. Ramban says the same thing. Ramban says, or something similar, Lo haya b'chol shiftei Yisrael mishen nafal biyad oivav zulati Shimshon. Right? He says, the only one of the judges who fell in the hands of the enemies is Shimshon, and that's not a good sign. I would also add to this what we said previously, which is that following the story of Shimshon's death, everything spirals, and precipitously, right? There's no more leadership, there's no social unity, there's a civil war. Everything seems to really spiral out of control, so that the Shimshon story doesn't really seem to accomplish that which it could have accomplished, right? And really it could have accomplished a lot. Shimshon is born after a Malach Hashem comes to his parents and tells them that they're going to have this son. He's given a divine destiny. He's a Nazir. He is incredibly strong, and he keeps getting this livui eloki, right? This ruach Hashem. God is accompanying him, and yet he does not manage to seemingly to live up to his potential. And we see this in what I think is a very significant midrash that we have on the words Lishuatcha kiviti Hashem, which appears in Bereshit during the brachot of Yaakov, right after the bracha of Dan. So the midrash says that when Yaakov was giving the bracha to Dan, he saw in the future Shimshon, and he said, oh, that must be the Mashiach, right? That's why that's right. We saw that on the grave, or the supposed grave of Shimshon and Manoach. It said Mashiach, right? That
Mashiach b'doro.
Mashiach b'doro. That he could have been, or that he was the Mashiach, the savior in his generation. And I think that he had the ability to be that, right? He was the Gur Aryeh. He was that lion-like leader who could have been a spiritual leader. He could have been a military leader. He could have been the leader that united Am Yisrael. And the Midrash tells us that when Yaakov saw that Shimshon died, he said, Af zemet? This one also died? Lishuatcha kiviti Hashem. Right? Ein lanu al mi lismoch ela al avinu shabashamayim. We have nobody that we can rely upon. Even Shimshon doesn't manage to pull us out of that mire that we find ourselves in during the period of Shoftim. So according to all of these opinions, Rashbam, Ramban, the Midrash, Shimshon ultimately is a disappointing figure. His death and what follows his leadership is a terrible period. He doesn't manage to do all of those things that we had hoped from him, from this Gur Aryeh, from this lion-like figure who, was really gifted with many advantages. So the question is why not? I think that the answer might lie in that midrash that I mentioned previously in Kohelet Rabbah, which compares Shimshon and David, and Shimshon becomes the one who does not use his strength for good, and David becomes the one who does use his strength for good. And of course, we mentioned that all of these things that we had hoped that Shimshon would accomplish, David does accomplish. So the question, of course, is why? In that midrash that we saw before, we saw the fact that someone is gifted with a certain trait doesn't necessarily spell success or failure. It's what the person does with that trait. So what is it that David understands that Shimshon does not? And I think that the answer lies in asking the right questions, right? In other words, the interesting thing about Shimshon is that he has this strength. He has this lion-like strength. He's has this confidence and this passion, but he never asks himself why? Why did God give me this tremendous strength? Why did God give me the ability to fight a lion barehanded? Right? Instead, he turns it into a riddle, right? A wedding feast amusement, right? And alongside of that, he never really uses the strength that he has, the Ruach Hashem that he has, to in a national context, right? To lead the people, to make that declaration of I represent God, right? And I don't use my weapons, I only use the name of God, and that's what enables me to be successful. And so ultimately, Shimshon is someone who, I mean, the pasuk, I'm going to twist a little bit, the pasuk, lo noda kocho, which I'm going to say is he doesn't really fully understand or self-consciously use his strength. He uses it for himself, for, you know, whatever happens to come along his way. You know, there is this one great moment with Shimshon when he becomes very thirsty, when he does seem to recognize that his strength is given to him by God. Yeah. And, you know, that's, of course, at the end of Perek Tedvav, where he turns to God, Vayikra el Hashem, and Vayomar, Ata natata v'yad avdecha et hatshua gdola hazot. Right? You gave this great salvation to your servant. And at that moment, we really think that Shimshon has recognized the source of his strength. But of course, in the very next, just a few psukim later, Shimshon is going back again to the Plishti territories to, you know, to find this woman. That's where Chazal, I think, are very, very upset with Shimshon. That's where they're very critical of Shimshon, is already beginning in that story, because he already has understood that his strength is not his to do with as he pleases. It's you know, God that gave it to him. And so, you know, even at that very final moment, going back to that moment of his death, when Shimshon is standing balanced on these two pillars, and he calls out to God and he says, Zochreini na v'chazkeini na ach hapam hazeh ha'elohim v'in nakma nekam achat mishtei einai miplishtim. Remember me, strengthen me, God, so that I can take vengeance for one of my eyes from the Plishtim. And what's missing here is any sort of declaration of, I'm doing this for Am Yisrael, I'm doing this in my position as leader, right? I'm doing this because I've been gifted strength so that I can accomplish whatever it is that the Mashiach, the potential leader can accomplish. And so ultimately it's that lack of self-conscious use of this great gift that God has given him, which means that he doesn't realize his full potential. I think that that has a tremendous lesson for all of us, right? You know, that Midrash said some people are given wisdom and they don't use it for good. And others are given wisdom and they use it for good. And the same is true about any gift that God gives us, where if you use it self-consciously, if you recognize this is not something which has been given to me to use for my own, it's been given to me so that I can realize the purpose of my existence, my divine destiny, that's the secret of success. And you know, the last thing I'll say is that this is really what we see with David, right? When David uses his strength to fight a lion when he's a shepherd, it remains with him a question, right? Why did God give me that strength? So that when he comes before Shaul and he wants to go out and fight the Plishti, he's been searching for how to use his strength in order to realize his destiny, the reason that God gave him this strength. And ultimately, that's why he uses it successfully. And he becomes that leader, that figure of leadership that Shimshon could have been had he used his traits purposefully in order to fulfill his divine destiny.
Are we going to blame his mother?
I'd rather not, but I, you know, maybe just on a positive note, you know, just look at all the things that David did accomplish, right? He lays the groundwork for the Beit HaMikdash. He unites the people. He, you know, even this final moment of Shimshon where he brings the house down, right, as opposed to David, who, you know, builds the house up. Even though obviously, you know, I'm not criticizing that act of killing these Plishtim who clearly are his enemy, but still doesn't seem to be the fulfillment of all of the potential that he had.
So as opposed to our kind of upsetting ending of the story of Shimshon in Tanakh, we have iterations of Shimshon throughout the generations that are neutral or more positive. So first of all, besides all the feelings that we have about this story, it's a really good story, right? It's a really exciting story, and that's why it ends up in so much culture, so much popular culture, so much Jewish culture, because it's just a really exciting story. So for example, right, hundreds and hundreds of years after this happens, there are Jews living in the Galil in the Roman and Byzantine period, making Batei Knesset with mosaics on the floor. We're familiar with mosaics that have menorahs, that have a zodiac, that have Akedat Yitzchak. But recently, 2 synagogues have been found that have scenes of Shimshon, right? And it's interesting. Was Shimshon a folk hero for these Jews in the Galil, right? One of them, Hukok near the Kinneret, is Shimshon carrying the gates of Aza on his shoulders, right? And the other one that was found a little earlier in Wadi Hammam, very close by, is this kind of a giant just beating up a whole bunch of people, and we're assuming that it's Shimshon. And it's fascinating because up until now we haven't found Shimshon. So Shimshon's story has captured popular imagination in a lot of different realms. But one of the most interesting kind of transformations of Shimshon is in Zionism, right? Like people like the Rashbam, the Ramban, they don't like Shimshon. When we come to 20th century and we are looking in Zionism for heroes, for people of strength, people of power, people of courage, who are the Zionists going back to? They're going back to Bar Kokhba, they're going back to the Maccabees, and they're going back to Shimshon. Right? Ze'ev Jabotinsky writes a novel about Shimshon. Shimshon becomes his images on stamps, right? We talk about songs about Shimshon HaGibor, right? It becomes kind of this model for how to present ourselves to the world as the muscular Jew and not just the intellectual sitting over the Gemara Jew. And my favorite Shimshon phrase, probably the prime minister we had who had the most of a sense of humor. David Ben-Gurion was a great man, didn't have a sense of humor. Levi Eshkol had a great sense of humor and a sense of like a very Yiddish sense of humor. And when France stopped selling us weapons in the 60s, Levi Eshkol sends Ezer Weitzman, who was at that time the head of the Air Force, sent him to Washington to campaign for us to get Phantom jets. And Weitzman says, well, how should I present Israel to the Americans? Should I present us as we're strong, we're a good ally, you need us on your side? Or should I present us as we're so weak and we need your help and we need us to sell these jets? And Eshkol says, I want you to present us as Shimshon der Nebuch Dicker, right? We're Shimshon, but we're Nebuch, right? We are both very, very strong, but we're very, very weak. And that's in many ways how we see ourselves, the state of Israel still today, right? We're the superpower in the region, but everybody hates us, anti-Semitism, everyone's attacking us, so we're Shimshon der Nebuch Dicker, which is a beautiful phrase.
Yeah. You know, I can really appreciate why Tzionut, why, modern Zionism appreciated Shimshon in terms of his strength and his deterrence. And at the same time, I think that even modern times, we have a lot to learn from Shimshon's failure. There are a lot of lessons that we could learn from Sefer Shoftim. Sefer Shoftim is the first period of settlement in the land, and what we learn from Sefer Shoftim is also, to some degree, how not to set up a society. What are the dangers of a society that is not socially united, that is not religiously faithful, and one where the leaders, instead of looking out for the people properly and seeing their own traits as ones that are meant to be used to serve the people, are using those traits to serve themselves. And instead of trying to do all the things that we need to do in order to set up a good society, which is why I think it's very important to end with David. Because of course, until today, we look at David as the ultimate leader, and it's not because he doesn't have weak points, but ultimately what we really learn from David is what benefits we can have from having a leader who sees himself as beholden to the people, property of the people. All of his traits are there, used in order to serve God and to help Am Yisrael to build a really strong society. So that's important to me also, to learn from Shimshon, even though I can well understand, and it's fascinating what you said about the way that modern Zionism has regarded Shimshon.
All right, so it was so much fun, like it always is.
As always.
And we hope you all enjoyed it too.
Let's do it again soon.